Welcome to the first speaker of the 2019 Festival of Birds held here at Rookery Bay Research Reserve. I have the privilege of introducing Anne Mauro. She is an avian ecologist here at Rookery Bay Reserve. She studies the shorebird and wading bird habitat use at Rookery Bay and monitors breeding birds within the reserve. Anne has a background in avian conservation and has worked with birds in many places around the country. This includes, but not limited to, the Missouri Ozark Forest Ecosystem Project, Tin Mountain Conservation Center in New Hampshire, and Florida State Parks, Audubon, Florida, in the Florida Panhandle. Outside of birding, she enjoys running, hiking, and photography. Anne will be speaking to us about the flamingo, Florida's forgotten wading bird. Please welcome Anne Mauro.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming in today. You're going to hear me talk about something that is very close to my heart. And as you can see by my ensemble, it is one of my favorite birds, and it's part of my identity. I had to choose this dress out of many flamingo dresses to wear today. So first I'm going to talk about why I became a part of this project and why flamingos are my favorite. I'm so interested in them that I've actually been a member of the IUCN Flamingo Specialist Group since undergrad, and I was the only undergrad who went to the International Flamingo Symposium in 2014. So I've been interested in them for a long time now, and why I like them is not because they're pink, but because they're a lot more than they appear to be. For instance, flamingos actually live in very locations in South America. So there's 3 species of flamingos that live in the mountains, and those are the Chilean, the Andean, and James flamingos. And they live in some crazy places, such as volcanic lakes. And when they roost in some of these lakes at night, they actually freeze in the lakes themselves, and they have to wait for the water to thaw out for them to break free. So just some of the conditions that these birds have to live through are incredible. Another crazy example is in Lake Natron in Africa. The flamingos, they live in a very hypersaline environment, and they're actually foraging in boiling water. They have special glands that takes away the salt, and they have very tough skin that they don't get burnt. So they're a lot more tough than this gentle, fragile bird that they may appear to be. And like I may have said, there are 6 species of flamingos, and they're all over the world, from Asia, Europe, to Africa, even the Galapagos, and now, of course, here in Florida. So just some fun facts as to why I love them so much. So flamingos everywhere, being in Florida. They're at all the gift shops, and if you find a postcard, there's probably going to be flamingo choices. It's even the symbol of our lottery, but do we know where this came from? Do we know why there is Flamingo, Florida, a place in Everglades National Park? Has anyone here ever seen a flamingo in the wild in Florida? Anyone? Yeah, so they are uncommon here, and then of course, when they are here, a large majority of the time, they're going to be in those places that are hard to get to, because that's the nature of such a flighty bird. So this is what opened up the discussion of why is it a symbol of Florida if they're supposedly not from Florida. So we first go back at a time looking at all these historical records, and we can't help but to notice, of course, Audubon's record. In 1832, he really wanted to see flamingos in the wild so he could get an illustration of them like he does of all of his birds. And he knew that if you wanted to see a flamingo in the wild, you go to Key West. This was common knowledge back in the day. He knew that he could have chosen from Mexico, he could have gone to Cuba, Bahamas, but he chose Key West. So that's pretty special that back then, people knew that that's where you could see them. And he mentions how excited he is that he's finally going to see them and maybe even hunt one so he could get his illustration. And he has this quote, "Far away to seaward we spied a flock of flamingos advancing in Indian line with well-spread wings, outstretched necks, and long legs directed backwards. Ah, reader, could you but know the emotions that then agitated my breast." So he was, that's how excited I would feel too if I saw them flying in the wild. So he did see them, of course. Unfortunately, he never got to kill one like he wanted to for his illustration, but when he went to Key West, he befriended someone who gave him that bird, and that is how he got that picture, is from a flamingo in Key West. And you will also notice a common trend with people eating flamingos in sightings. So John Lee Williams, to our surprise, flamingos were reported around Tampa, Hillsborough Bay. We're a little skeptical of this for reasons you'll learn why later, but it's not too hard to believe, because if you were to actually flip that area on its side, you would see that it resembles the same estuary of Yucatan Peninsula, which is where the flamingos breed in Mexico. And also something to consider is that Tampa was one of the earliest cities in Florida, so they very likely had the earliest hunting pressures on the birds, that there wouldn't be that many birds there from a long time ago. And you could see he thought they were great food too, and he even describes going down to Key West and eating flamingo in the Key West style. So they had their own style for this bird. And something else to think about is that Key West was known for being sustainable at that time. They only ate what they could get easy access to. So that means flamingos were there in enough numbers that they could just go out there and get them for food. So even north of Tampa, they saw flamingos, and they knew when you saw them, you hunted them because apparently they were delicious. So even north of Tampa. We have sightings from a coastal surveyor, Wurdemann. He was sent on an assignment to go out and survey the Florida Bay area. But when his captain saw a flock of 100 flamingos, he had a different plan for the day and decided to jump out and just grab all of them. And apparently he could do that because they were young and they couldn't fly they were young, they couldn't fly at the time because they were molting. We're a little skeptical of this because flamingos don't molt completely to the point they can't fly. They have partial molting. So what we actually think what it was is that these birds were young and they couldn't fly yet, which would mean they're breeding somewhere in Florida Bay. Also, it's very hard to catch flamingos. The zoo has tried. So for them to catch 100 of them, it was most likely they couldn't fly yet. And up in the Panhandle, so I don't know if any of you have heard about this flamingo that's being seen in St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge, but there's one up there right now. And it's not the first time that it's been seen up in the Panhandle. Even before in the 1800s, again, they were captured and people had them for dinner. So Ingraham, there's a lake named after him in Everglades. So he reported seeing flamingos 2,500 in Florida Bay. That's what's east of Cape Sable. And also 7 flamingos right in the backyard of Rookery Bay, Caxambus. So back in the day, if you were on Marco Island, you could have seen a flamingo or two. And what's interesting about Ingraham is that he met some Native Americans and he learned how they caught them for food. And they actually used a very long rope to corral them, and that's how they condensed them into this small area to kill them for food. So this tells us a lot about the history of flamingos in Florida. So we know that they were now being hunted by early settlers, but now it opened us up to the fact that even before the settlers, Native Americans have been hunting them this whole time. So this is very intense pressure on them. It's not good for a species that has a low reproduction rate. And what I mean by that is they only lay 1 egg when they breed a year, 1 egg at a time. And they don't even breed every year. They can only breed if the environmental conditions are just right. So for them to get that intense of a hunting pressure, they're not going to rebound fast if they're going to rebound at all. So Pierce, we now know that they were being hunted for food, but not only for food, but for skins. $25 for a skin back then, compared to 50 cents and $10. So people had incentive to go out to these really muddy places where they forage and go get a flamingo. So Scott, this is one of our last sightings we have, a flock of 1,000 around Florida Bay, and he suggests that they're year-round and they likely nest there. This sighting, this is sad because this is the last sighting we have for a great number of flamingos for a while. In 1902, there were 500 to 1,000 flamingos in Florida Bay. And we have not seen more than 10 flamingos in 100 years from that point. They all disappeared. We don't know what happened to them. We don't know if everyone hunted them out or if they decided, based off of the pressure they were getting, to move on to a different country, because it's been shown that they have done that before in other places. But since then, we haven't seen more than 10 flamingos in an area in Florida. So from this, we have learned something. So we have a minimum estimate of how many flamingos there were in Florida. We know they were here year-round. Some people suggest that flamingos may only pass through Florida in the spring, but we know that they were here year-round originally. They were pretty much extirpated by 1900, and we know why: the skins and the meat. So something to keep in mind is that these are the same characteristics of species that are protected by federal or state laws, and right now the American flamingo is not protected in the US. So it was really interesting for us to look at these historical numbers, but we were interested in nesting. Did they nest in Florida? So we do have one report that someone may have seen whitish stumps. So now you know what their nests look like. It's very unusual. And this is why they have such a low reproduction rate, because they need this specific habitat that isn't going to be available every year. So they, like I said, they'll lay one egg and have one chick. And Sugarloaf Key, of course, that's in the Keys, and that's around where they reported seeing the stumps. This is not direct evidence. We can't say for certain that, yes, this means flamingos nested in Florida, but it's definitely interesting to look at with all the other sightings. And something else that is interesting is the fact that we now have access to a lot of these records, such as egg records. So before, none of these, even the historical sightings, wouldn't have been available to us. We probably wouldn't have been able to do this study just 5 years ago because people are just now digitizing all these records. So we remembered that people back then, they didn't have Pokemon or baseball cards to trade. So oology, a fun word, for egg collecting, that's what people did. They traded eggs. They went out there, they found different bird eggs, and they traded them, and they made little cards for them, egg cards for them. So we thought, let's go and look at these museum records online and see which eggs, if there's any flamingo eggs from the 1800s that are listed to be from Florida. Of course, there's some issues here with the fact that since the cards were traded, they could have been lost, or people could have maybe exaggerated on the cards since it was a hobby. But it's definitely interesting for us to look at, and we actually did get some hits. So there's a flamingo egg, and that's what the card looked like. It claimed to be from Florida Keys, and then we got very excited over this. And to our surprise, we found another one, also from the Florida Keys. This egg has an interesting story because it was lost the longest time, and they just recently found it. They only had the egg card at the American Museum of Natural History. So we found the egg card, and we got excited. There was an egg card for a flamingo egg from the Keys, and then just recently, before we sent in our paper for the final edits and the proofs, the museum found the egg with other eggs hidden somewhere, but so the egg was found after all, but so there it is, and we have that third egg. And then also, right before we submitted our paper for the final edits, we got another hit, 2 eggs with 1 egg card, flamingo eggs collected in Florida. So again, not direct evidence, but it's really cool to see that there are that many eggs that claim to be from Florida within that time period. So what we did do is we compared this to other species that we know are native to Florida. One of them being the reddish egret. We looked at reddish egret skins in museums from Florida around that time period in the 1800s, and there were 3. We looked at the white-crowned pigeon. The white-crowned pigeon had 1 egg from the 1800s. And the roseate spoonbill had 4 eggs. So all of that is very comparable with the flamingo in the 4 different egg cards that we found in museums. And we also found about a dozen flamingo skins that claim to be from Florida in museums too. So it is comparable to other species. Now what we have here is direct evidence. So it has been known as the gospel for the longest time that if you see a flamingo in Florida, it is an escapee. And it's probably from Hialeah racetrack because they've had flamingos since 1930 and they can fly. So that's been the gospel. We've never had evidence, though, of them being escapees before. But now we have evidence, hard evidence, that flamingos, not every flamingo you see in Florida is going to be an escapee because of resighting bans. So in 2002, we got a bird from Yucatan, Mexico. And then in 2010, as you could see, another bird from that same breeding colony. So this is really special that we could resight these birds. We know now that they're dispersing on their own, and they're not just all coming from a zoo. And something interesting to look at, so these are the Hialeah birds. These are the birds that were with the banded bird from Mexico. Does anyone see a difference? So we learned that the Hialeah birds are fed corn and dog food. So that they're not gonna look very pink. So it is an indicator, if you see a bird, especially around the Miami area, because they don't leave the racetrack often. They're always at the racetrack, they're always there every day, so they don't leave often. So if you're in the Miami area, you see a bird that looks like this, just not a lot of pink pigment in the bills. The bills are pretty white, and it's also a different shade of pink. I've heard people call flamingos more of an orange than a pink before, so I guess it just depends how you see colors. But there's definitely a difference. So the zoo, they actually have special food with a lot of carotenoid in it for them to have that color because they don't know what will happen if you take that color away from them. It could be used for social behavior, they're not sure. But what they do know is that it actually helps for sun protection and it helps against cancer. So it is important that they have that color. It's not just all for show. So this gets us interested in asking the question, where are they coming from? Are they all coming from Mexico? Are they coming from Cuba? And where are they going? So this leads us to Stormwater Treatment Area 2, which is an area, very rural Palm Beach County, next to Broward County, in the middle of nowhere pretty much. And flamingos have been flying there for 10 years every spring. And we don't know where they're coming from. And we don't know why they choose the area that they're choosing right now. So this is them in the bottom, picture I took of them. And Audubon of the Everglades over there, people, they were breaking into the stormwater treatment area to see these birds. So because of that, they have special tours that you can sign up for to see them in the spring. And I went on one of those tours with my now fiance. He proposed to me on one of those tours. So that's why we have that cheesy picture there in front of the sign for Stormwater Treatment Area 2. Probably the only couple crazy enough to get engaged in a stormwater treatment area in the middle of the Everglades. So. Nah, the ring too. So yeah, that was a special moment. And of course, on that day, the flamingos didn't show up. But we saw a lot of skimmers, so it was all good. So yeah, there's the flamingos, they go there every year, and I even saw them copulating one time there before. So that was also very special to see. And some people have noted that these flamingos also look a little white, but they definitely have more of the pinkish, orangish color that the ones we know for sure, wild ones from Yucatan, than the Hialeah birds did. Hialeah actually reminds me of a spoonbill pink. Some people can't see the difference, but I can. The spoonbills have more of a lighter pastel pink, and that's what the Hialeah birds remind me of. So Zoo Miami, they learned we should probably go over there and catch these birds, put a GPS transmitter on them, and see where they're coming from and where they're going. So they try to do it. There is a reason no one bans adult flamingos. They can't get them. They're very flighty and sensitive. They go to isolated areas where you just can't get even close to them. When they are banded, in Mexico, they're banded as chicks before they can fly. There's only one person who's ever banded an adult flamingo, and that was in Africa. They actually used a large hard wire metal grid with nooses on it. Some people call it a noose carpet. And it worked for them to catch a lesser flamingo. So the zoo tried that. And one flamingo got very close. It kind of stepped on the carpet and tripped up a little, but then it got free. So they tried a large mist net, which is a large net that's thin enough that most birds can't see it. So it was held up by two poles, but the net kept falling down. So that didn't work. And this is significant because in 2014, there was up to 147 flamingos seen in STA2. We haven't seen more than 10 since 1902. So that is the most flamingos that we've seen in Florida since 1902. So that's very significant. And hopefully we could catch them again in the future. But there was another chance. So at Boca Chica Air Base in Key West, there were 3 flamingos hanging out, and they wouldn't leave for the longest time. They were kind of in people's ways. So if you know anything about flamingo behavior, you would know that if there's 3 birds and one looks younger than the others, it's probably the offspring of the 2 parents. So that's what we think was going on, and eventually the 2 older birds, they flew off, and 2 birds were seen in snakebite the next day in Flamingo, Florida. And this one, juvenile, we could tell because of the grayish there, he just stayed behind and he kept getting in people's ways. So USDA called the zoo and they said, hey, can you come and get this bird because we don't want to be known for shooting a flamingo. So the zoo said, sure, we'll come, despite them never being successful in capture before. So they came. So this is aerial of what it looks like, and the confused faces of them trying to explain how it's gonna work. And that's the habitat that the bird was seen in. So there's a bird just sitting there. And then we have the nets, and we're just thinking about how is this gonna work, just staring at the bird, trying to get a game plan. A thing to realize about flamingos is they do have very long runways when they fly. They can't just get up and fly like other birds. They actually have to start running like a plane. So it's just something to think about for if you are capturing a flamingo, think about their behavior. They are gonna have to have a running start, so it's a good method for where to place the net. Luckily, the Key West Wildlife Rehab Center had a nut gun. So someone from Key West Rehab Center came out, and with enough people in the background clapping, making lots of noise, scaring the bird toward the net gun, there was success. So the bird was finally captured. It was named Conchy after the Conch Republic in Key West. So there's the team, Zoo Miami and the Wildlife Rehab Center, very happy. So we're all excited about this. This is the very first flamingo that's been banded in Florida. wild flamingo that is. And it got a 0-1 band for the first flamingo, too. Unfortunately, Conchy could not be released because he is non-native. So this is when there got to be some logistical issues, if you will. On the FWC website, there was information on them being escapees from zoos. Again, we don't have evidence for that. Meanwhile, if you look at what U.S. Fish and Wildlife says, you'll learn that they are native and they need a population recovery action. So there's a little bit of miscommunication. And the last time anyone ever did a thorough study of the history of flamingos in the U.S. was 1956. So they were due for a review, definitely.
How do you tell it's non-native?
Non-native? Well, that's what we'll go into now. So there was a lot of claim, and I don't know, I'm trying to remember the name of the person who first said that they were non-native, but there was someone who studied flamingos and had this huge flamingo Bible of them, of the Caribbean flamingos, the American flamingos, and he said they are most likely from zoos. So that assumption has been around for nearly a century, and we don't have anywhere any evidence to back up that that is the case. So and that's why the flamingos are what we call a victim of generational knowledge, because since that was said, it was passed down from generation to generation and no one questioned it. So that's why they're thought to be non-native with us not having evidence. So Conchy, he was banded with the help of Michelle Davis, a federal bird bander, and with the help of Tony Pernas from Big Cypress National Preserve. We got a permit because there was a compromise. Conchy was not native, but a native vagrant. So there you go. So that's all it took for him to get released in Everglades National Park with his parents. So, yeah. But it's a great example of all the partnerships that this takes to get something like this done. This couldn't have been done with just the zoo alone. You needed USDA, the rehab center, a bird bander, National Park Service. I mean, to get projects like this going, it's just great that we could get these different agencies working together. So that's him after his release. You can see his little GPS transmitter. That's the same kind that they use for whooping cranes, actually, and that's where the zoo got the idea. So that takes 4 GPS points a day so they can get information on roosting and foraging and night behaviors versus day behaviors. And then there's his US 01 band. So that's there we know now. So after the release, he traveled a little. That's where he was released. And this is Snakebite. He traveled a little far away from Snakebite, but stayed in the area roughly. Unfortunately, a maintenance worker at the park, he found them along a road looking really ill and pretty much dying. So he was rushed back to the zoo, and they found out that Conchy actually had a liver fluke. So liver fluke, it comes from snails, and basically it just damages the liver. And it was remembered that where Conchy was at the Air Force Base, there were a lot of snails. So they kept him away from people so he wouldn't get used to people. And he didn't. He actually fought a lot when he was released again. There was a lot of fighting, and then they had his second release. Unfortunately, he was not allowed to be released back in the national park because of the disease, but birds don't care about borders. They're going to go where they want to go. So Everglades is pretty much like right here. Conchy was released right there. So he was released just outside the border, and it was his choice to fly in the Everglades National Park. So the first place he went was State Key. This is State Key. It's got a very large basin in it, a shallow water basin, covered mangroves on the edges. So it's sheltered. If a boat were passing by, they probably wouldn't be able to see a flamingo. And there's actually a lot of keys in Florida Bay that look like this. So it just asks the question, how many flamingos or other birds are in Florida Bay that we have no idea about because they're all in the center of a mangrove island. So we have his movements, and there are sightings of Conchy. So we know he's doing well. He really likes that State Key area. He visits Snake Bight sometimes. He's seen with another flamingo. It's definitely, this one has that orangish color for sure, so he's seen with another flamingo. And more pictures of him doing well, being healthy. And notice he never leaves Florida. He never leaves Florida Bay. We thought maybe he would show us where he came from by flying back to that area. That never happened. So he never leaves Florida. So we learned from this what habitats flamingos like in Florida Bay. These very, very shallow, huge mudflats. And Florida Bay is known for having massive stretches of mudflats, even more so than Rookery Bay. And that's great for birds. So we learned that that's what Conchy really liked. And there he is with two other flamingos. This whole time he was seen with other birds, other flamingos. So he wasn't the only flamingo in Florida Bay either. So there's also the question we've had, what happened with Irma? Did Conchy make it? Well, we know where he was before Irma. Right there, State Key, his favorite hangout place. And then after Irma, he decided to go near Snake Bight. But then we got no more signal. So there's three outcomes from that. He was in deep water, his transmitter failed, or he was gone. But after 2 months, we get this super blurry picture of 5 flamingos at Snake Bight. And from there, you probably can't see, you can't make out much except for that these are flamingos, because what other bird will have that silhouette in Florida? But you zoom in enough, there is this little blue blur on the leg. So we know that Conchy did survive. And now we're back to the old method of we don't get updates of where he's at on the phone, but we have to go out and just depend on people reciting him for where he is. So now we're dependent on other people reciting him. So it was a sample size of 1. It's not a lot. You have to work with what you're given. But we did learn something for sure. We learned that flamingos can live in Florida Bay year-round for multiple years. We know what habitat they like and how they move around in Florida Bay. We were hoping we could find out where Conchy came from. We don't know. We haven't had that connection yet. We're still working on it. So this is where my part got really active in the project. So I looked up all the sightings of flamingos since 1900 and compiled them together to see if there's any trends with flamingos in Florida. I used eBird, an online website that some of you are probably familiar with, reporting birds and where you're seeing them. I also looked at rare bird forums that they have online and just different naturalist newsletters. This was a little difficult because since a lot of people have the assumption that any flamingo you see in Florida is an escapee, a lot of them didn't even bother reporting it. Or if they did report it, it's not visible to the public because when eBird says a bird is an escapee, you can't have access to that data. So I still think there's a lot of data I'm probably missing from this, but I did get something. And with what we got, we have some trends. Of course, there's going to be the bias that more people are birding now than they used to. So you're going to have more observations. But the total number of flamingos observed and the maximum group size, we found that they're increasing. So that's pretty significant, especially when you add it up together with the fact that 147 birds showed up. And you have Conchy with his friends who never left Florida Bay, stayed there year-round. So it does make you think they are probably making a comeback to Florida. So how are we going to tell what's a wild bird versus a Hialeah bird, pretty much? So we're working on that. We're still in the very early stages of stable isotopes. But we are hoping that once more birds arrive, hopefully this spring, to Stormwater Treatment Area 2, we could get some banded. The zoo now has a drop net, actually. So that's 4 poles with a net on top. So what you have to do is you go out there and you first have to figure out what habitats are the flamingos using, because as you know, they're super flighty. You can't just go out there one day and catch them. It's a whole series of days. So you have to go out there, observe the behaviors, figure out where to put the net, and then you have to install the net. And then you have to wait several days for them to get used to it being there, and then wait for them to be under the net. So it is a process to get the flamingos. And of course, by doing talks like this, after the talks, I'm meeting people who say that they have net guns and they're willing to help out. So it's great to just make those connections. This year would have been a great year to try catching the flamingos, except the water was too deep in stormwater treatment area 2. There was actually a tilapia outbreak. So this year they came by, but they didn't stay for long because the water was too deep. So hopefully this upcoming year will be better. So we're looking at the stable isotopes, and this is, again, very preliminary data. So we know that the Zoo Miami flamingos, here they are, versus Hialeah. And then this flamingo of unknown origin, that was roadkill found on a Card Sound road going into the Keys. So it's unique to see that they're that different. Who knows where this one came from? But with a feather sample, that's what we can do. So that's what we're working on, and we're actually in contact with people working with flamingos in the Bahamas and Mexico to getting feather samples, to comparing them to what we have here in Florida to try to see if there's any resemblance or similarities. So this is a paper that came out that I'm a co-author on, and it talks about all this that I've discussed and more about the history of flamingos in Florida. And I'm very blessed that they let me be a part of this project, being when I came into it fresh out of college. So it has some of the top people for biologists in South Florida, and it's definitely awesome to be a part of a project like this. So this was the webpage of FWC before the paper was published. You see that they are non-native. This is the website after the paper was published. So we don't know what the status is now, actually. It has been said that they are native to parts of Florida. We don't know what parts are, but it is a step in the right direction. And it's important not just because we want to be able to release birds back in the wild. That's not the only thing, but also these birds right now as it is, they're not protected by any laws because they're not native. So if someone sees a flamingo, they can shoot it. So with the status, with being protected, we can work on a recovery plan for the species since they likely are making a comeback. And there are steps in the right direction. So Zoo Miami has a petition with the National Park Service and also Audubon to get them federally protected and also state protected. So that petition, it's been going forward on the state level, so we'll see what comes of that. So our next steps in research, of course, we want to capture more birds, get more information on stable isotopes, and look at what they're eating. So why are they going to this same spot in stormwater treatment area 2 every year? So would like to look at that, definitely. Also, something to consider is that the flamingo is actually least concerned according to IUCN, but they're very vulnerable. I say that because historically they had 30 areas to nest in the Caribbean. Today they have 6. So that's a lot fewer, and if anything were to happen to those breeding colonies, where would the flamingos go? So they're definitely vulnerable, especially since in Mexico, a constant threat is disturbance of tourism. There's a lot of people who want to see them, but unfortunately, the boats, they scare them away from the nest, so there's that constant threat that they have in Mexico. So they're definitely a bird to keep an eye out for conservation. But Florida isn't the only place that they may be making a comeback to. In Venezuela, they also just recently returned there for the first time in many years. So their population, we know, they are dispersing on their own naturally in the Caribbean to new places. So the future, like I said, it's unclear, but you could stay tuned with Facebook, the Zoo Miami Conservation and Research page. They do a lot more research projects than this. This is just one of the many. And hopefully we'll have updates next year for the Festival of Birds on more flamingo tagging or something of that nature. But these are all the partners we used. It was, like I said, a lot of different agencies got involved. And I just want to thank you for coming here today to learn about them.
What other shorebirds are they related to? I'm sorry.
That's a good question. There's constantly new research on what flamingos are related to, and they're always finding new answers. So the last I believe I heard is that they're actually closely related to grebes. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. It's always changing with new methods.
Based on behaviors, or I mean they don't.
Not behaviors,
DNA?
structure. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
There's the flamingos. They're very unique in their behavior. They're the only bird that feeds upside down, with their head upside down. So when they feed, their head's upside down. So they're the only bird that does that. So there's nothing else quite like the flamingo in behavior. So that's why to find out what they are related to is going to be shocking, because whatever it is, there's nothing out there that's quite like a flamingo.
Right.
I have. It's on. Okay. Who? Oh, okay.
How much do you know about what they do eat?
About
What
who?
they eat?
Oh, what they eat? So we know right now in Florida, we're not sure. When we go to stormwater treatment area, we do see a lot of snails actually. But based off of studies from Mexico, it's basically, since they filter feed, it's anything really tiny invertebrates. They just sweep their heads back and forth. So it's not like they're selecting for specific prey, but they're just getting the tiny minuscule invertebrates and shrimp into their bills. So that's typically what they eat, but we don't know how those species are different here in Florida. Something else that's really unique about the birds returning to STA2 is that they're in fresh water. In most places, they're in salt water. So so that's why we're curious, what is here that they're actually choosing this freshwater habitat? So we'd like to learn that.
Are they a monogamous species?
Yeah, so we're not totally sure on that. It's hard to prove, but to our knowledge, yes and no.
And Conchy was male, female?
Oh, male.
Male. And at
Yes.
what age would he be looking for a mate?
So actually around age 6, I believe.
And how old is he, do you think?
How old is he? So right now, he would probably be around 2 to 3.
Oh, okay, so it would be some time before he looks to form that bond.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the places where they breed, those little mounds, what kind of area is that? Is that sand or?
Mud.
Mud. Okay, and that's naturally formed, or the flamingos
They
form
make those.
They make those mounds.
Yeah. If you go, some of the zoos in Florida, they likely have breeding pairs, and you can watch in zoos. It looks like it takes forever because they constantly bring these really tiny little pieces of dirt up, and what they do is they just sit down and they just build while they're sitting under them. Yeah.
And it's a male and female together that do that? Or
Yeah.
is it one sex or
Yes.
the other? Yeah.
It's the male and female.
Yeah, down in Key West at the butterfly place,
Oh,
they
yeah.
have scarlet and ret.
They have
And
what?
They have scarlet and ret, 2 flamingos,
Oh.
and they do a lot of communication between the two with a lot of heads going side
Oh,
to side
yeah.
and going
Head
up
flagging?
and down. Yeah, I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's interesting just to sit back and watch.
There's names for the behavior: head flagging, wing saluting. It looks It's very, very cool looking to see them all like marching, just looking straight back and forth. But that's what they do. Yes, they are, and that's something that people don't understand is, again, they're not just this fragile, graceful bird. They're really loud, very smelly. They constantly fight. I studied their behavior slightly at the zoo, and they're very cliquey birds. They get in their group of friends, and if someone moves just slightly out of that group, there's a big fight. So there's constantly fighting going on in these colonies. Yeah.
What can we do to help? You mentioned a petition that you were making in Florida. What can we do to help to protect them?
Do you want to wait for them?
Do you want to repeat the question?
Okay, yeah. What the question was, what can we do to help? So a good way is to just report when you find something that looks like it could be a flamingo. A lot of people have the issue of not being able to tell when something's flying in the sky. Is it that spoonbill or a flamingo? So just becoming familiar with the silhouette difference. Flamingos, they fly with their necks straight out. Spoonbills aren't going to have that long neck silhouette. So right there, that will help you. And also, if you just look at the pictures of them, again, you'll notice there is a difference with the shades of pink. It's hard to describe, but like I said earlier, I do think that spoonbills have a more pastel shade, and flamingos have that orange. So reporting that will definitely help. The zoo wants to know too. And if there are flamingos sometimes seen in urban areas, I know there was a flamingo at an urban beach in Miami that looked quite different from the Hialeah birds. People, they go there and they get too close because they really want to see it. So like it is with all birds, stay a safe distance away and just don't scare these birds. Help out volunteering just with organizations like Audubon and supporting places like Zoo Miami and National Park Service and the people who do this research. That is always a way you can help too. But right now, as it is with specifically the Flamingo Project, is just keeping an eye open for those birds and spreading the message on that there's more to the escapee idea than we think. And it's very likely that not all the flamingos you see in Florida are escapees. So also sending that message will help a lot with the stereotype of flamingos in Florida.
In your research, did you look into instances of escape from zoos and take that into account? Like, were you looking at records of birds that have actually escaped, and what are the numbers there?
Yeah, so we did talk to zoos when we saw records of flamingos that were in odd places. One of them, there's 2 flamingos that constantly hang out at a casino in Miami. Very hot pink. So they're not eating the corn and the dog food because they're very hot pink. So those ones, we've asked people and no one knows where those came from. So we're still unsure about them because they're constantly at the casino. Yeah, so that's interesting. But the other birds, flamingos, they just don't escape often. And I could say from working in a zoo, the keepers notice because they take count of those birds every morning. A lot of the zoos, if not every accredited zoo that I know of, and even the non-accredited zoos, they ban the birds. Yes. So it's good if you do see a banded flamingo in Florida, look at the band. Is that a band that would be from a zoo? Report the band in some way so you could find out, is it from a zoo or is it from Mexico? But like I said, most of them, Hialeah doesn't ban birds, and that's actually our next step too, is we are getting together to ban the birds at Hialeah. So we have those bans, it's gonna happen. So we can finally start to put an end to this. That's not a Hialeah bird because it doesn't have this band.
Right. I only lived in South Florida a short time, I'm not birding experts, but it does seem like the typical wading bird has a long neck. You know, that seems like a typical feature. But the flamingo has an unusually long neck. Can you comment on that and how that's evolved and why that has come to be, if you know?
Mm-hmm. I would say it definitely. Oh, yes. So the question is, how did the flamingo evolve with such an unusually long neck compared to other wading birds? So if you look at its behavior, it definitely uses that neck for foraging. They hang their heads down low, and their ideal foraging habitat, it's in the inches or centimeters, and they're just sweeping their head, like I said, back and forth. So that long neck, it just helps them with getting farther down in the water, and also with social behaviors likely too. So they do head flagging. So it's possible that somewhere along the lines, another flamingo saw a bird with a very long neck that was bobbing its head back and forth, and it thought that that looked good. That was a good indicator of health. So it could have also been selected for in that sense. But unlike other animals with long necks, they don't do it to reach anything in trees. It's all used for reaching down in the water and then breeding displays.
You referred a lot to Florida Bay. Where exactly is Florida Bay?
Yeah, let me see if I could get to a map. So Florida Bay, it's an amazing area. If you definitely have a chance, I would recommend going there. So that's a close-up map. Let's see if I can find one of the earlier zoomed out maps. It's in Everglades National Park. So it's the area, actually, I could just describe here. It's the area between Cape Sable, southern peninsular Florida, and the Keys. So this is Florida Bay. Very large and all very shallow.
So where is Marco compared to that?
Marco's not on this map. Marco's.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, Florida Bay does have a lot more huge, expansive mud flats. We have mud flats, but they're pretty small. Florida Bay, they're all over the place. And just to help you get an idea of how shallow it is, when I went out with grad students in the area, it's so shallow that they told me to prepare for a night stay. If we get stuck, just bring a blanket with you whenever we go out, bring food, bring all this stuff, because there's a very good likelihood we'll get stuck for the night. So that's what I was told when I went out to Florida Bay to help work, because it's just that shallow. So they always prepared for the worst. And I think there might be another question.
Where in the world would they say is the biggest natural population of flamingos, wild ones?
That is a good question. So I believe right now they do flamingo censuses around the world, and we're coming up on the one for South America next month. But the greater flamingos, I would say, is the largest because they have such an expansive range. So they're in Africa, Greece, France, India. They travel so much. So they're not that flamingos are known for being generalists, but if there were a species of flamingo that is more generalist, I would say it's the greater flamingo, just because it does have a lot more habitat that it has adapted to than the other 5 species. Yes, so the greater flamingo is Europe, Africa, India. Lesser is pretty much, for the most part, restricted to Africa, Caribbean, or American is another name for it. And then South America has the most species, with the James, Andean, and Chilean flamingo.
We have one here.
Yeah, to clarify, it's not protected in its politics or whatever. Do Mexico, Cuba, places like that, are they flamingos protected there?
That's a very good question. So their nesting for sure is protected. The largest nesting area in Bahamas is called Inagua. They are very protective of their flock, and the public can't even access there. To go there, you have to have special reservations. I know, of course, because I wanted to see them in the Bahamas. So they are definitely protecting their breeding grounds. In Mexico, of course, they are having that issue, though. There have been people doing studies on trying to put a cost to flamingos to see, like, what are they worth when people go on these tours, and how can we help, with that cost to try to make people get it, but also preserve the bird. So they're definitely trying to put more conservation strategies forward, but as far as protection laws and what's illegal and what's not, I am not as familiar with the foreign laws as I am here.
I'm really confused about why they would have, when they were hunting them for food, and you said also for the skins. Mm-hmm. What did they use the skins for?
That's a That's a good question. My guess, and we don't know this for sure because most of the records talked about food, and we were actually shocked. They have these pink feathers. You'd think that they'd talk about the feathers in the hats like they do with the great egrets, but it was all about food. So we didn't find a lot of records talking about what they did with the skins, but my best guess would be that it was something of wealth. If you could get a hold of a flamingo skin, it was like this sign of wealth, or maybe they did put them in their hats like they did with other plumes of other wading birds. But I'm surprised that we didn't come across that more in the writings.
Well, thank you very much. I think we all enjoyed that.